Now that we've talked about how not to practice vibrato, let's talk about how to practice vibrato and how to approach it and incorporate it into your normal practice routine. So first off, you want to think of vibrato as building blocks. A lot of times students try to go straight to doing a vibrato and they skip all those stages, and that's going to slow their progress down again. So really focus on each of the individual building blocks of vibrato. And that's how this course is structured, to help you focus on those building blocks. The first part of the course, we're going to focus on building blocks. And the second part of the course will work on perfecting vibrato and finishing it off and being able to add it to your normal songs and pieces. But first, you got to start with stages, start with those building blocks. The next thing you want to think about as you're practicing vibrato is how much time you really spend on the exercises. Now, I know we've already talked about having that ratio, kind of that 3-to-1 ratio, practice your scales 3 times as much as you practice vibrato. But when you're first starting off, I want you to spend a very small amount of time each practice session doing these vibrato exercises. You may start off with just a minute or 2 minutes, and that might be plenty. Because if you do this too long, you're probably going to get a little frustrated, which brings me to my next point. Don't get frustrated. Vibrato is a frustrating action. It's very kind of awkward at first, and it does take time to get used to it and to kind of teach your muscles what to do. So you've got to remember, if you're frustrated, you're going to tense up, you're going to lock up, and that's automatically going to make vibrato a million times harder if you're tense. So as soon as you start to get frustrated and confused, stop practicing vibrato, move on to something else. And sometimes you may need to quit practicing altogether. And this is kind of a concept that applies to your normal practice routine. If you're getting frustrated, stop, move on. You're not going to make any progress while you're frustrated. I also want you to continue focusing on those basic technique aspects of violin. I know I've said this before, but it's so important. Intonation, bow control, tone production, rhythm, all of those things have to take a priority over vibrato practice. When you're practicing your scales, when you're practicing your songs and your pieces, always make sure those aspects are in order first before you try to start working on vibrato. Now I want you to think about when you're going to do that vibrato practice. I don't suggest you do it right at the beginning. I think you should warm up by doing stretches first. Now, I don't have a one way to do stretches. I think as long as you're working on big muscles and then you work your way down to smaller muscles, anything you can do to get your muscles warmed up will be good. So always start off with stretches. Then I go to open strings. That helps me make sure I'm really just focusing on my bow and my tone control. Then I move on to scales. That gets my left hand warmed up. And then I might do etudes and then work on my normal pieces. So as you're starting to work on vibrato, I think you should add in that vibrato practice after scales or maybe after etudes or kind of warm-up exercises, kind of in between that song that you're working on and the warm-up period. I don't suggest doing it at the end of your practice time for a couple reasons. One, your hand may already be pretty tired. And the next reason is that you always want to end your practice time on something that you do well, on a piece or something that you feel really comfortable with, maybe an old song. You always want to end on a high note with your practice routine so that you're excited to come back and practice the next time. If you end on a low note or if you're getting frustrated, then that's not going to set you up well for your next practice session. You also want to make sure that your fingers are warmed up in other ways. So I actually like to use this little thing. I think it's technically called a squishy, just to make sure that my fingers are kind of limber and that they're warmed up. And you can do this all throughout the day. This is especially great if you've had any wrist injuries or hand injuries or surgeries. Just make sure that your fingers are limbered up. And along with that, make sure your fingers are warm. I know my fingers tend to get colder than the rest of my body, and that makes playing, especially vibrato, tricky because they're stiff and cold. So if you need to run them under some hot water or put them in front of a heater before you do some vibrato, it will help you stay limber and relaxed. The last thing I want you to consider with your practice time in vibrato is that there are more than one ways to skin a cat. And there are more than one way to learn vibrato. There's more than one way to perfect vibrato. And I hope that you take time to experiment with vibrato, to try different techniques and tips. And this course hopefully is going to offer you a lot of different perspectives and viewpoints on vibrato. And I hope that you take what you can and apply that to your own practice time to where you develop your own personal vibrato that works for you. Now, if you keep all of those practice tips in mind, you will enjoy practicing vibrato and you're going to make a lot of progress on it.